When Desmond Doss entered the US Army, he did so carrying a conviction that immediately set him apart. He believed in serving his country without taking a life. In an institution built around weapons, discipline, and force, this choice sounded not just impractical, but incomprehensible. To many around him, refusing to carry a rifle was seen as refusal to be a soldier at all. Doss's decision did not emerge from fear or indecision, but from a deeply internalized moral framework. He did not reject the war, nor did he question the need to fight it. Instead, he drew a sharp line between participation and killing. He volunteered to go to the front, fully aware of the dangers, but insisted that his role would be to save lives, rather than take them. This distinction confused even those inclined to respect conscience. Military training camps were unforgiving environments for difference. From the first days, Doss was subjected to ridicule, suspicion, and open hostility. Fellow soldiers interpreted his stance as cowardice masked as faith. Officers questioned whether discipline could be maintained if personal belief overruled standard procedure. Doss endured isolation not because he avoided hardship, but because he accepted it without compromise. What made his position more disruptive was its consistency. He did not seek exemption from danger or demand special treatment. He trained, marched, and deployed like everyone else. The only thing he would not do was touch a weapon. This forced the army to confront an uncomfortable question. Could courage exist without violence? Doss's presence made that question unavoidable. At the front, the abstract debate dissolved into reality. Combat did not care about belief systems. Artillery, gunfire, and chaos erased theoretical distinctions. Even here, Doss held to his role with clarity. As a medic, he moved forward when others moved back, focused not on enemy positions but on wounded bodies, left exposed by retreat. His refusal to carry a weapon did not make him passive. It made him singularly focused. Without a rifle, his only tools were bandages, judgment, and persistence. Where others suppressed fear by returning fire, Doss confronted it by advancing into danger unarmed. His actions forced a re-evaluation among those who had dismissed him as weak. Over time, skepticism gave way to a different kind of recognition. Soldiers who had once mocked him began to rely on him. His presence altered the emotional landscape of the unit. He became proof that bravery was not tied to aggression and that moral conviction, when matched with action, could be as steady under fire as any weapon. Desmond Doss's refusal to carry a weapon did not begin on the battlefield. It was formed long before he ever put on a uniform. His conviction was rooted in a personal reading of faith that treated the commandment against killing not as a metaphor, but as a literal obligation. For Doss, belief was not something to be set aside under pressure. It was something to be carried forward, even into war. What made his stance unusual was not simply that it was religious, but that it was uncompromising. Doss did not seek a safer assignment, or argue that his beliefs excused him from danger. He accepted the full risks of combat while rejecting one specific act within it. This selective refusal unsettled military logic, which depended on uniform behavior under fire. His faith did not remove him from war. It placed him inside it on different terms. The army initially struggled to categorize him. Regulations allowed for conscientious objection, but usually at the cost of frontline service. Doss rejected that path. He insisted that saving lives was not a secondary role, but a direct contribution to combat effectiveness. In doing so, he challenged the assumption that killing was the central measure of a soldier's value. This refusal carried social consequences. Fellow soldiers interpreted his stance as judgment, even when none was intended. Some felt that his presence implied moral superiority. Others feared he would be a liability when violence erupted. Doss responded not with argument, but with consistency. He did not preach, provoke, or explain himself repeatedly. He allowed his behavior to speak where words failed. Faith also shaped how Doss understood fear. Without a weapon, he could not rely on firepower to create distance between himself and danger. Instead, he leaned into a belief that obedience to conscience mattered more than personal safety. This did not eliminate fear, but it reordered priorities. Survival became secondary to fidelity to principle, a reversal that many found difficult to comprehend. From the earliest days of training, Desmond Doss became an outlier in an environment designed to erase individuality. Military camps relied on uniformity to build cohesion, and anything that disrupted that process was treated as a threat. Doss's refusal to carry a weapon marked him immediately. Before his abilities were tested, his intentions were judged. Ridicule emerged first as humour. Jokes circulated about his usefulness in battle, often disguised as camaraderie, but sharpened by suspicion. Fellow recruits questioned whether he would freeze under fire or endanger others by his presence. In a culture where trust was built on shared readiness to kill, Doss's stance was interpreted as a fracture in collective resolve. As training intensified, mockery hardened into exclusion. Doss was left out of informal bonds that formed during drills and downtime. Meals, conversations, and shared grievances passed around him, rather than through him. This social isolation carried its own discipline. It reminded him daily that belonging came at a cost he would not pay. Pressure also came from authority. Some officers viewed Doss not as a moral exception, but as a disciplinary problem. His refusal to conform challenged command structure by suggesting that obedience had limits. Attempts were made to break his resolve indirectly, through extra duties, harsher scrutiny, and constant questioning of his motives. The aim was not to punish outright, but to exhaust. In this environment, silence became Doss's primary response. He did not argue his case repeatedly or appeal for sympathy. He absorbed criticism without visible resentment, focusing instead on completing every task assigned to him with precision. This refusal to react denied his critics the confrontation they expected, but it did not lessen the pressure. The deeper strain came from implication. Some soldiers believed that Doss's presence would force others to compensate for his refusal to fight. In combat units, the fear of unequal burden carries real weight. Resentment grew not from what he did, but from what others imagined they might have to do because of him. Doss carried that projection without protest. What made the situation more severe was its persistence. Weeks passed, and the pressure did not fade. Doss's convictions did not soften, and neither did the resistance around him. The standoff became routine, woven into daily life. Each day of training reinforced the divide, turning skepticism into expectation. Yet beneath the ridicule, something quieter was taking shape. Doss's endurance altered the dynamic in subtle ways. He remained present, capable, and unbroken. Without asking for acceptance, he demonstrated reliability. The mockery did not disappear, but it lost some of its certainty. Doubt began to shift, not about him, but about the assumptions used to judge him. In an institution that prized toughness, Doss revealed a different kind of resilience. He did not push back against the unit. He stayed within it, absorbing pressure without surrender. That choice would matter later, when the definition of strength would be rewritten under fire. Desmond Doss's path toward becoming a combat medic was not a retreat from combat, but a deliberate step deeper into it. While others trained to engage the enemy, Doss trained to confront the consequences of that engagement. The role placed him at the point where violence and survival met, demanding presence under fire without the protection of aggression. Medical training reshaped his identity within the unit. The focus shifted from ideology to function. He learned to work quickly with limited supplies, to make decisions in seconds, and to stabilize bodies under conditions that erased calm. Bandaging, morphine administration, and triage became acts of urgency rather than procedure. In this space, belief had to translate into competence. The army did not lower its standards for him. Combat medics were expected to move with infantry, often ahead of safer positions, exposed to the same fire as riflemen. Doss accepted this without reservation. His refusal to carry a weapon did not reduce his exposure. It increased it. He entered combat zones with only a helmet marked by purpose and hands trained for repair. Deployment altered how others saw him. In the field, theoretical debates lost relevance. Wounds demanded immediate attention, and hesitation could be fatal. Doss's reliability in these moments began to overwrite its earlier assumptions. He moved toward injured soldiers instinctively, without waiting for orders or reassurance that the area was secure. The rhythm of frontline service was unforgiving. Combat medics rarely had fixed positions. They followed advances, endured retreats, and worked in terrain shaped by destruction. Doss learned to read the battlefield not for enemy movement, but for human need. Listening for calls, scanning for motion, sensing where help would be required next. Trust developed unevenly, but decisively. Soldiers who once doubted him began to signal for him by name. This trust was not granted out of admiration, but necessity. In chaos, the medic's role was one of proximity and vulnerability. Doss did not remove himself when conditions worsened. He stayed, and that consistency carried weight. Emotionally, the role demanded control without detachment. Doss treated friends and strangers alike, often under fire, often without time to process loss. He compartmentalized not by hardening himself, but by narrowing focus. Each wounded soldier became the entire mission, if only for a moment. Okinawa was not just another island on a map. It was a gateway to Japan itself, close enough to make the final invasion imaginable and terrifying. By the time Allied forces approached in 1945, the Pacific War had hardened into a struggle where neither side expected mercy or quick victories. Okinawa promised something worse. A battle fought at the edge of exhaustion, where every yard of ground would be paid for in bodies. The island's terrain turned strategy into suffering. Rain transformed soil into mud, movement into a grind, and supply lines into fragile lifelines. Hills became fortresses, caves became bunkers. The defenders did not meet the invasion with a single dramatic clash on the beaches. They absorbed it, withdrew into layered positions, and forced the attackers to fight uphill into a system built for delay and maximum casualties. For American infantry units, days blended into a continuous cycle of advance, fire, and loss. Mortars and artillery cut open the landscape, and the air carried the constant crack of rifles and machine guns. The psychological pressure was relentless. Noise without pause, sleep without rest, and the feeling that the enemy was everywhere, even when unseen. In Okinawa, the battlefield was not a line, it was an environment. Above them, the war expanded into the sky and sea. Kamikaze attacks struck Allied ships with a brutal logic, sacrifice to inflict fear, damage, and disruption. Sailors watched burning decks and twisted metal drift on the horizon, while troops on land heard the distant thunder and understood that no part of the campaign was sheltered. Okinawa was a total battle, consuming ground forces and fleets in the same breath. One place on Okinawa came to symbolize this descent into chaos. The escarpment Americans would call Hacksaw Ridge. It was a steep cliff line that forced soldiers to climb upward by cargo nets into open danger, emerging onto a plateau where the terrain offered little mercy. Reaching the top did not mean safety, it meant exposure. Men stepped off the nets into a world of shattered rock, cratered earth, and sudden gunfire. The ridge was not fought like a clean assault. It was fought like survival. Japanese positions were dug into caves and ridgelines, designed to reappear after bombardment and punish any attempt to move forward. Explosions erased landmarks, smoke broke visibility into fragments. The battlefield became a series of small violent encounters, where a few meters could decide whether a squad lived or vanished. Under that kind of fire, the senses narrowed. Soldiers learned to read the ground by instinct, where the bullets were coming from, where the nearest cover might exist, where a wounded man could be dragged without drawing more shots. The ridge created a cruel math. To rescue someone often meant exposing yourself, and to hesitate often meant losing them. This is where the work of medics became almost impossible, because the wounded did not fall in safe places. Medical aid on Hacksaw Ridge was not performed in clean stations behind the lines. It happened in trenches, shell holes, and open ground under the same gunfire that caused the injuries. A medic had to decide who could be saved quickly, who needed immediate morphine, who needed pressure on an artery, who needed to be moved now or would die in minutes. These decisions were made with hands shaking from fatigue and adrenaline, not from uncertainty. The ridge also generated a special kind of terror, the fear of being cut off. Units could climb up, but retreat, especially under pressure, could turn into a fall, back into chaos. When assaults stalled or counterattacks hit, the escarpment became a trap. Men risked being stranded on the top, with the cliff behind them and enemy fire in front. In those moments, even the strongest sense of discipline could fracture into raw instinct. Okinawa's violence did not end with one day or one push. It returned in waves: attack, defense, rain, bombardment, silence, then sudden fire again. Hacksaw Ridge was one chapter of a larger nightmare, but it carried the battle's essence. Endurance under constant threat, courage stretched past logic, and the feeling that the ground itself was hostile. By the time the fighting moved on, the ridge remained in memory as more than a location. It was an image: men climbing into gunfire, medics crawling toward the wounded, explosions turning stone into dust, and the sense that the war had reached a stage where survival required something beyond training, something closer to stubborn, exhausted willpower. As the fighting on Hacksaw Ridge stalled and then collapsed into retreat, the plateau above the cliff was left scattered with wounded men. Orders were given to pull back. Darkness, smoke, and enemy fire closed in. In that moment, the battlefield emptied, except for one figure who remained. Desmond Doss stayed behind, alone on ground that had not become safer simply because others had left. He moved without a pattern that could be tracked, crawling, dragging, lifting, stopping, then moving again. Each wounded soldier was found in a different condition, in a different place, under a different kind of threat. Doss did not rush in a way that wasted effort. He worked deliberately, aware that haste could expose both of them to gunfire. The ridge did not allow heroics, it demanded patience under fire. What sustained him was not momentum, but repetition. After lowering one wounded man down the cliff by rope, Doss returned to the top again, and again. Each time, the calculation reset. How much strength remained? How much time? How much noise could be risked? Between rescues, he paused only long enough to whisper the same words. Lord, help me get one more. It was not a speech or a ritual. It was a request made in exhaustion. The act of lowering the wounded was as dangerous as finding them. The cliff edge offered no cover, and every movement risked silhouette against the sky. Doss tied knots with hands numbed by strain, guiding bodies downward into darkness where others waited below. The rope became a lifeline measured not in meters, but in trust. Trust that it would hold, and that no shot would come at the wrong second. Enemy fire did not cease, and explosions did not respect his task. At times, Doss was wounded himself, yet he continued. His refusal to carry a weapon did not make him invisible. It made him exposed. He survived not because the battlefield spared him, but because his movement never aligned with expectation. He was not advancing, not retreating, not attacking. He was retrieving. Those below the ridge lost count as men kept coming down. What began as disbelief turned into quiet realization. Someone was still up there. Each body lowered was proof of presence, of persistence. The numbers accumulated not through announcement, but through weight. Another wounded man, another stretch of rope, another life removed from the edge of death. By the time the rescue ended, the exact count was uncertain. Estimates would later settle around 75 lives saved, but the number mattered less than the method. No weapon was fired. No enemy was engaged. The entire action existed outside conventional measures of combat success. It was not a charge, not a defense, not a victory in the traditional sense. What Desmond Doss accomplished on Hacksaw Ridge was not the result of a single moment of bravery, but of sustained decision. Each return to the plateau was a choice made after pain, fear, and exhaustion had already taken their toll. The prayer for one more was not symbolic. It was literal, repeated until there was no one left to find. In a battle defined by overwhelming violence, one man altered the outcome for dozens through refusal rather than force. The ridge did not become less deadly, and the war did not pause. But in that stretch of time, life was pulled back from the edge again and again, by someone who carried nothing but faith, rope, and the willingness to stay when leaving would have been easier. When the fighting ended and the noise of battle receded, Desmond Doss returned from Okinawa carrying a reputation that no longer resembled the one he had left with. The soldier once dismissed as weak, unreliable, or disruptive was now spoken of with a different tone. The transformation did not happen through speeches or self-defense, but through testimony, given by the very men who had once doubted him. Within his unit, the shift was immediate and irreversible. Soldiers who had mocked his refusal to carry a rifle now described moments when his presence meant survival. Their stories did not frame Doss as an exception to the rules of war, but as proof that courage could exist outside them. Respect replaced tolerance. Silence replaced ridicule. The hierarchy of strength inside the unit quietly rearranged itself. Recognition moved upward through command structures that had once questioned his place in uniform. Reports from Okinawa could not ignore the scale or consistency of his actions. What set Doss apart was not a single dramatic rescue, but the sustained nature of his effort under conditions that broke others. His conduct forced military leadership to confront an uncomfortable reality. Heroism had arrived without a weapon. National acknowledgement followed, but not without hesitation. Doss did not fit the traditional image of a war hero. He did not speak of enemy casualties or tactical victories. His story resisted simplification. Yet the evidence was undeniable, carried by witnesses and records that converged on the same conclusion. The nation honoured him not for how he fought, but for how he refused to fight, and still served. When Desmond Doss stood to receive the Medal of Honor, the moment carried layered meaning. It was not only recognition of bravery under fire, but of moral resolve under pressure. The highest military decoration was placed on the chest of a man who had never fired a shot. In that gesture, the definition of valor expanded. Doss's legacy did not end with medals or ceremonies. His story continued to circulate because it posed a question that outlived the war itself. What does it mean to serve without surrendering conscience? In a century defined by mass violence, his example resisted easy categorization. He did not argue against war in theory. He acted differently within it. His life after the war reflected the same quiet consistency that defined his service. Doss did not seek political platforms or public influence. He spoke when asked, often reluctantly, framing his actions not as personal achievement, but as obligation. This restraint preserved the integrity of his story. It was not polished into propaganda. It remained human. In military ethics, Doss became a reference point, rather than a model to be copied wholesale. His path was not presented as a universal solution, but as proof that moral diversity could exist within disciplined structures. He demonstrated that obedience and conscience were not mutually exclusive, but in tension, and that living within that tension required resilience. For later generations, his story offered an alternative language of heroism. It suggested that bravery could be defined by endurance rather than dominance, by preservation rather than destruction. In classrooms, training manuals, and personal reflection, Doss's life challenged assumptions about strength and duty that often went unexamined. Desmond Doss did not change the nature of war. Violence remained violence, and suffering remained unavoidable. What he altered was the moral imagination surrounding it. He showed that even in the most brutal environments, individual choices still mattered, and that those choices could save lives without taking others. From outcast to hero, from mocked recruit to symbol of conscience, Doss's journey traced a narrow path through war without surrendering humanity. His legacy endures not because it was loud, but because it was consistent. In a world shaped by force, he left behind something rarer, an example of conviction that endured under fire and remained intact when the war was over.